Welcome to 5 Things to Fix. I'm Peter from Birds of Play, and together we're gonna take a hard look at Final Fantasy XIII-2 and how it could have been made even better. Final Fantasy XIII-2 is already a game that takes fixes very seriously, with a lot of energy having been spent on avoiding the criticism that was directed at the original Final Fantasy XIII. For example, by making the game a lot less linear and making the battle system a lot more responsive. Therefore, we have our work cut out for us, having to come up with 5 more fixes. But we're not ones to shy away from a challenge. If you end up liking the video, don't forget to like the video. And if you're ready for some more Final Fantasy in your life, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and join the birdhouse. That's a thing we say now. But without further ado, let us change the past by changing the future. You know, it's like something they say in the game, so it's like a reference. You get it. Fix number 1. Hope for the future. Say what you will about hope from the original Final Fantasy XIII, but the hope we were introduced to in Final Fantasy XIII-2 seems to have it all figured out. In the 3 years that separate the two games, Hope has really come into his own, becoming one of the world's leading minds as well as a leader of men. Faced with the knowledge that Cocoon will one day fall from the sky, ushering in the end of humanity, Hope dedicates his life to saving mankind from this tragic fate. In this sense, Hope's mission is the same as Sarah and Noelle's, even though their methods differ significantly due to Hope not being a fellow time traveler. As a story about time, I've always felt that it was a bit of a shame that the game doesn't explore the theme of aging, or how the passage of time really affects people. Instead of always meeting hot, young adult Hope, I would have liked to see him growing older, especially since his many accomplishments seem to warrant a bit more time passing. I mean, you don't just invent a time capsule or create an artificial substitute to your former mechanical overlords in a matter of years. Letting Hope grow older would also help emphasize how his path is different from that of Sarah and Noelle's, as he's not simply jumping from one point in time to another, but actually living his life in accordance with the passage of time. Also, maybe having an older, more mature character around would add something to the game. Much like SAZH's maturity and adult problems in the original Final Fantasy XIII grounded a game that might otherwise have just been about teenage rebellion. Fix number 2. SAZH it up. Speaking of SAZH, aka the most lovable character from the original game, his role in the sequel is fairly limited, with him only making a few appearances near the end of the game, as well as having a dedicated DLC episode available once the game is completed. As I already mentioned in the previous fix, SAZH can bring a lot to the table, his character being a fan favorite for a reason. But increasing SAZH's role in the game wouldn't just be for the sake of what his character can bring to the table, since it's also a question of how self-contained Final Fantasy XIII can be said to be. As things stand, SAZH's inclusion in the climax of the game seems a bit unearned, and likely to alienate players that aren't all that familiar with the original. But I don't want to simply suggest that the game needs more SAZH and be done with it, since I also have an idea about where to stick him, possibly killing 2 birds with 1 stone. And by the way, that's just an expression. You shouldn't actually throw rocks at birds, but the point in the story that I had in mind is the part where you have to collect graviton cores for Hope and Alyssa, mostly by revisiting some earlier locations. Even though this might encourage us to further explore the game world, it's the only part of the game that feels like filler material, allowing the developers to reuse some assets. This would be fine if there was some actual story attached to it, as opposed to just having you run around looking for invisible objects until you finally realize that you have a family and adult responsibilities, so you end up using a guide on the internet. But I digress. Flavoring this mission with a little bit of SAZH might go a long way towards not only preparing us for his appearance at the end and his DLC episode, but also turning some fetch quest filler into a real killer. Just remember not to kill birds by throwing rocks at them. This message is brought to you by the Birds of Play. Fix number 3. MOOGLE throw. Speaking of things that fly and throwing things, Morg is a flying moogle that you can actually throw. But you don't just throw Morg to get rid of him, even though some of you might be tempted to do so. Throwing Morg can actually be a very important part of the game at times, helping you reach valuable items that are out of reach when employing more conventional means. In itself, this is a welcome enough gameplay mechanic, and introduces new ways to interact with and think about the environment. My only problem with it is that if you miss your target and Morg ends up getting hurled into oblivion, you have to wait quite a while until you get him back. In this case, the fix would be fairly simple. Let players recall Morg back to their side at their own convenience, instead of having to wait for him to find his way back. If you're going to make me throw, don't make it so slow. Fix number 4. Mythic Mundanity. Even though we play as the people on the ground, Final Fantasy XIII-2 is in essence a struggle of cosmic proportions, wherein divine entities lie at the heart of what is happening in the world. The mythology that informs the world of Final Fantasy XIII has always been very fascinating to me, but the myths themselves very rarely take center stage. Instead, the mythos is filtered, if you will, through the characters and turned into something much more mundane. One such instance is when Sarah proposes the possibility that they are in fact not visiting different points in time, but rather different parallel worlds. Hope, however, brushes this off by saying that the people of Padra believe that there is only one world, due to the fact that the goddess Etro could only imbue so many living beings with her essence. I feel like this is a very powerful point, but it's somewhat flippantly presented as fact by Hope, who got the information from some very old dead people.
The people of Padra believed that there was only one true history. They taught that the goddess could grant life to a limited number of people. If true, this precludes the possibility of countless alternate worlds, populated by infinite numbers of people.
A part of me wonders whether Hope really has enough evidence to make that claim as a scientist. And if he does, why can't we just see the evidence? Take us into an ancient cave or something where the ancient people painted their beliefs on the walls. Or use that projector thingy to show us. Just give me a visual representation of what it is we are meant to believe in. Not because I have a problem with believing in the existence of gods in a fantasy universe, but rather because they, and the mythology surrounding them, are actually one of the most fascinating parts, and it's a shame not to show them. Fix number 5. Back into the cocoon. Final Fantasy XIII-2 does an admirable job of expanding on the world of the original Final Fantasy XIII, not only by looking at the immediate present, but also the distant future. One thing I wish it did a bit better would be exploring the past as well, and not only the mythological origin of the world, as I talked about in the last fix, but also the cocoon of old. During the events of the original Final Fantasy XIII, we bear witness to the downfall of Cocoon by being thrust into a sequence of events that had already disrupted much of everyday life on the floating continent. Just like Midgar from Final Fantasy VII and Insomnia from Final Fantasy XV, Cocoon is one of those incredibly fascinating locations from the Final Fantasy series that never really gets the attention it deserves. However, since we have the ability to time travel in Final Fantasy XIII-2, it feels like a shame that we didn't get the chance to revisit Cocoon in its prime, before everything went down the drain, in order to better understand Cocoonian society. Adding a Cocoon segment to the game would have been interesting in and of itself, but it could also have made us appreciate what we lost even more intimately, thereby retroactively giving us a deeper understanding of Cocoon when replaying the original Final Fantasy XIII. Give me more Cocoon. It's not just another moon.
Hello everyone, it's me, Nökkvi, the other one. We hope you liked the video, and if you did, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and join the birdhouse. Now it's time for the complimentary bird sounds, for those of you that made it to the end. Cuckoo!